On December 7, 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, crippling America's Pacific Fleet. In the following months, Japanese forces rapidly expanded, seizing the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, and pushing deep into the South Pacific. For Americans, this was a dark period. News of one defeat after another crushed public morale, while the long-term strategy remained unclear. The Roosevelt administration understood that the United States needed a decisive action, not only as retaliation, but also to assure the American people that this war could still be turned around. A strike on the Japanese homeland itself, something that had not happened in centuries, was seen as the boldest option. In this context, a daring idea emerged from an accidental observation. In January 1942, the U.S. Navy held training exercises at Norfolk, Virginia, using a runway painted to resemble an aircraft carrier deck. Army bomber pilots were practicing short takeoffs in twin-engine aircraft. Navy Staff Officer Francis Lowe suddenly wondered, why not try putting Army bombers on a real carrier to strike deep into Japanese territory? This was a concept completely outside tradition, since carriers had only ever operated light attack aircraft and fighters with shorter wingspans and weights suitable for deck operations. A B-25 Mitchell, a twin-engine bomber with a wingspan of over 20 meters and triple the weight of standard carrier aircraft, was theoretically incapable of taking off from a carrier deck, let alone landing back on one. But in wartime, the impossible often became the spark for turning points. Lowe's proposal was quickly passed up to Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Navy, and then to General Henry Hap Arnold, Commander of the Army Air Forces. Both agreed the mission was feasible, if placed under the right commander. No one fit better than James Harold Doolittle, a veteran bomber officer, famous test pilot, MIT Ph.D. in aeronautics, and a master of calculated risk. Doolittle took command in February 1942. His job, train the crews, modify the aircraft, and turn this audacious idea into reality in the shortest possible time. Immediately, a special unit was assembled at Eglin Field, Florida. The chosen pilots came from the 17th Bomb Group, the most experienced B-25 unit. When Doolittle asked who was willing to join an extremely dangerous but secret mission, all 140 men stepped forward. From them, 24 crews were selected, later reduced to 16 who would carry out the operation. These men became the Doolittle Raiders, a name etched into history. Alongside training, technical modifications were rushed through. Each B-25 was fitted with an additional 265-gallon steel fuel tank in the bomb bay, plus rubber bladder tanks and extra gas cans. This nearly doubled their fuel capacity, giving them a range of over 2,000 miles, enough to launch from waters off Japan, bomb major cities, and continue on to China. To cut weight, the belly turret, unnecessary radios, and even the Norden bomb sight were removed. In their place, wooden dummy guns were mounted in the tail to bluff enemy fighters. These seemingly small adjustments made the difference between survival and disaster on such a risky mission. The hardest training challenge was short runway takeoffs. Navy Lieutenant Henry Miller, the team's sole naval instructor, taught a precise technique. Full flaps, brakes held, engines at maximum power, then releasing the brakes while easing the control stick. The results were astonishing. While Japanese estimates assumed a B-25 needed at least 800 feet to take off, Doolittle's crews managed in under 500 feet, one even setting a record at 287 feet. The impossible was proven possible. By early April 1942, the plan moved into execution. 16 B-25s were hoisted aboard the carrier USS Hornet on the U.S. West Coast. The sight of massive bombers crowding the deck left many sailors stunned. They had never seen anything like it. On April 2nd, Hornet and her escorts sailed, joining Admiral William Halsey's task force centered on the carrier USS Enterprise. Together they formed Task Force 16, the fleet that would deliver Doolittle's bombers within range of Japan. The voyage took days. On deck, Crews drilled constantly, checking every detail, fully aware that once airborne, none would return to the carrier. Their only hope was to reach China, land safely, or bail out over Allied-controlled territory. In essence, this was a one-way mission. Beneath the disciplined surface, all knew survival odds were slim. On the morning of April 18, 1942, when the task force was still 650 nautical miles from Japan's coast, an unexpected setback struck. The Japanese picket boat Nidomaru spotted them and sent a warning. With the mission compromised, Halsey ordered the bombers to launch immediately, more than 200 miles farther out than planned. This greatly increased the risk of running out of fuel, but there was no choice. Doolittle and his men pressed on. One by one, the heavy B-25s rolled down Hornet's deck amid pounding seas, water crashing over the bow. As mission commander, Doolittle led the way, his bomber thundering toward the edge. For a breathless moment, it seemed the aircraft would plunge into the ocean, then its wings lifted and it soared skyward. The deck erupted in cheers. The impossible had become reality, and a historic mission was underway. As the first B-25, piloted by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, lifted off from the deck of the USS Hornet, the entire fleet erupted in excitement. But this was only the beginning of a perilous journey. One by one, the remaining 15 B-25s followed. Each 150-meter dash along the deck sent hearts racing, for even a slight miscalculation could send the heavy aircraft crashing into the raging sea, dooming the six-man crew. Fortunately, all 16 planes successfully soared into the gray morning sky of April 18, 1942. Their flight path stretched nearly 650 miles to the Japanese coast. With no fighter escort and no fallback, they relied solely on surprise and speed. As the hazy outlines of Japan's islands emerged beneath their wings, many pilots were breathless with tension. Before them lay enemy territory, considered inviolable for centuries. No one in Tokyo could have imagined that one day American planes would appear in their skies. Doolittle's plane led the way, flying low over the suburbs and straight into the capital. Before releasing the bombs, he descended further to identify industrial and military targets. When the 500-pound bombs dropped, shrieking down onto steel factories and fuel depots, the city shuddered. Explosions roared across residential areas, black smoke billowed skyward, and civilians panicked and fled. Within minutes, Tokyo, the proud capital of the Japanese Empire, had been bombed for the first time from across the Pacific. Following Doolittle, 3 other planes attacked Tokyo, targeting aircraft factories, fuel depots, and scattered military objectives. 6 more redirected to Yokohama, Nagoya, and Kobe, key industrial and port centers. Some bombs hit fuel depots, sparking massive fires. Others struck residential areas, destroying dozens of homes. In just 15 short minutes, all 16 B-25s had dropped around 64 bombs on Japanese territory, delivering a shocking strategic blow. Material damage was modest, roughly 90 buildings destroyed or damaged, 50 dead, and over 250 injured. But the psychological impact was immense. From the imperial family to ordinary citizens, shock and disbelief swept through Japan. How could an enemy traverse thousands of miles of ocean, penetrate all defenses, and bomb the heart of the empire? The long-held belief in Japan's inviolability, lasting more than 600 years, collapsed in a single morning. Prime Minister and Army General Hideki Tojo was so enraged that he ordered a full-scale investigation. The officer responsible for Tokyo's air defenses, shamed by the failure, committed suicide. Meanwhile, the American pilots pressed on in their desperate journey. Having taken off 200 miles earlier than planned, they knew fuel would be insufficient to reach the designated airfields in China. Yet no one turned back, all pressed westward. Along the way, many aircraft flew through heavy rain and strong winds. As night fell and visibility waned, fuel gauges plunged to critical levels, forcing crews to make a final choice: land in unknown territory or bail out. Most chose to parachute. In the darkness, dozens of pilots leapt into the rugged Chinese mountains. Some were fortunate enough to be rescued by villagers and secretly escorted to Allied bases. Others landed in areas controlled by Japanese forces. In total, 8 were captured. Of these, 3 were executed following sham military trials. 1 died in prison, and the remaining 4 endured harsh captivity for 40 months, repeatedly tortured, before finally being repatriated at the war's end. Doolittle himself, after parachuting into Jiangxi province, was rescued by locals and returned safely to a base. Initially, he believed the mission had failed, as all aircraft were lost and many pilots unaccounted for. He prepared for demotion or even a court-martial. But upon returning to the U.S., Doolittle and his men were hailed as heroes. President Roosevelt personally awarded him the Medal of Honor, and the public saw the raid as the greatest morale boost since the Pearl Harbor disaster. Meanwhile, Chinese civilians paid a heavy price for aiding the American airmen. The Japanese carried out one of the most brutal revenge campaigns in history. 3-alls policy: kill all, loot all, burn all, targeting the rural regions where the American pilots had landed. An estimated 250,000 Chinese civilians were killed, and many villages destroyed. This tragic episode revealed the war's cruelty and the human cost borne by ordinary people for strategic decisions. The raid's impact on Japan was also profound. An empire that believed its territory was untouchable was forced to divert hundreds of fighter aircraft back home, weakening frontline operations. Emperor Hirohito and the Japanese General Staff made a strategic misstep, accelerating plans to seize Midway Island to expand their buffer and destroy the U.S. carrier fleet. Just 2 months later, at the Battle of Midway, 4 Japanese fleet carriers were sunk, altering the entire course of the Pacific War. Thus, the Doolittle Raid, though causing relatively modest physical damage, became a psychological and strategic turning point. It demonstrated to the world that Japan was not invulnerable and that the United States had both the will and capability to strike back. For the American people, it was a vital morale boost after dark months. For Japan, it was a stark warning of a long and grueling conflict far beyond what they had imagined. The raid on April 18, 1942, went far beyond the mere burning of a few dozen buildings in Tokyo, Nagoya, Kobe, or Yokohama. Its true impact rippled over months, even years, reshaping the entire Pacific War. In a single night, Japan's proud belief in its invulnerability was shattered. Since the 13th century, when the Mongols failed twice to invade due to the divine winds protecting Japan's coasts, the Japanese people had never experienced the terror of enemy attacks on their homeland. Doolittle and his 79 pilots tore through that illusion with just 16 B-25s. For Japan's leaders, it was a humiliating shock. Emperor Hirohito remained silent, but deeply concerned. Prime Minister and Army General Hideki Tojo was furious, demanding that the military immediately reinforce homeland defenses. In the following weeks, hundreds of fighter planes were pulled from hot fronts in the Philippines, Dutch East Indies, and Burma to defend Tokyo and industrial cities. Anti-aircraft units were strengthened, and a network of radar stations and observation posts sprang up along the coast. Japan, previously on a relentless offensive, was suddenly forced to divert significant resources to passive defense. Even worse, the Doolittle Raid triggered widespread fear among civilians. Emergency evacuations and large-scale air raid alerts disrupted daily life in major cities. Anxiety spread, prompting the Japanese government to intensify efforts to destroy the U.S. carrier fleet, the force that had brought bombs to Tokyo's skies. From this urgency emerged the accelerated plan to attack Midway, a gamble with life-or-death stakes. Originally, Admiral Yamamoto, the commander of Japan's combined fleet, intended to lure the U.S. Navy into a trap and annihilate them in a decisive battle. Midway, a small island between Hawaii and Japan, was chosen as the bait. After the Doolittle Raid, Yamamoto had even more reason to expedite the plan. If the U.S. carriers were not quickly eliminated, similar bombing raids could continue, directly threatening the Empire's prestige and security. Consequently, just 2 months after the Tokyo raid, Japan deployed a massive force of 4 heavy aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, with hundreds of escort ships heading for Midway with the aim of destroying the U.S. fleet. Yet, it was precisely this haste that led Japan into an unexpected trap. U.S. intelligence had broken part of the Japanese naval code and knew the Midway attack plan, preparing an ambush. When the battle erupted in early June 1942, it was a disaster for Japan. Within hours, all 4 fleet carriers were sunk, nearly 300 aircraft destroyed, and thousands of elite sailors and pilots lost. Meanwhile, the U.S. lost only 1 carrier, the USS Yorktown. This marked a decisive turning point, shifting the balance of naval power in the Pacific toward the Allies. In other words, the Doolittle Raid did not directly destroy Japan's military strength, but it planted the seeds for the catastrophic defeat at Midway. With a symbolic strike, Doolittle forced Japan to alter its strategy, make hasty decisions, and ultimately lose the carriers that were the backbone of its naval power. Across the Pacific, the psychological effect was equally profound. When news of the raid broke, a nation mired in gloom erupted in excitement. Headlines screamed, "U.S. planes bomb Tokyo." Crowds cheered in the streets, seeing it as proof that America could strike back and eventually triumph. The event reinforced public confidence in President Franklin D. Roosevelt's leadership and bolstered the military's fighting spirit. Politically, the raid also demonstrated to the Allies, particularly Britain and the Soviet Union, that the United States was serious and capable of bold operations. Churchill called it the first glimmer of hope in a dark sky. Stalin, though not publicly praising, recognized that the U.S. had dared to strike the enemy directly, something the Soviet Union had long hoped for to relieve pressure on the Eastern Front. For the U.S. military, the Doolittle Raid offered profound lessons. They realized the psychological power of symbolic strikes and the importance of innovative strategy beyond conventional norms. Putting Army bombers on a carrier, once considered crazy, became a model for flexible inter-service cooperation. Later, in the island-hopping campaign, this same bold spirit remained central to every operation. However, the cost was high. All 16 B-25s were lost, 8 pilots were captured, 3 executed, and 1 died in prison. Most tragically, Chinese civilians paid the heaviest price. Over 250,000 were massacred in Japan's brutal reprisal campaigns. This darker side, rarely highlighted in heroic narratives, reflects the ruthless reality of war, where each strategic decision can cost hundreds of thousands of innocent lives. Yet from a global strategic perspective, the Doolittle Raid achieved its most crucial objectives: restoring American morale, instilling fear in Japan, and accelerating the chain of events leading to Midway, the decisive turning point of the entire war. Many historians argue that the raid's true significance lies not in the bombs dropped on Tokyo, but in the cascading consequences that followed. It changed strategic thinking on both sides, rewriting the history of the Pacific War. Today, looking back, the dual nature of the Doolittle Raid is clear, both a brilliant morale victory and the source of immense suffering. But in the larger context of World War II, it stands as a prime example of how audacious actions, even on a small scale, can create a domino effect capable of shaking the entire theater of war. After the smoke and flames of the Tokyo Raid cleared, history turned a new page. The Pacific War would continue for another 3 years with countless brutal battles, yet the image of 16 B-25s taking off from the deck of the USS Hornet on the morning of April 18, 1942, remains an enduring symbol of courage and inventive spirit. Those who participated in the mission, whether they survived or fell, became immortalized in the collective memory of both the United States and Japan. James Harold Doolittle, the mission commander and the first pilot to take off, initially believed he had failed. When he parachuted into Chinese territory, he expected to be demoted for losing all the aircraft without achieving significant damage. Yet upon returning to the U.S., he was celebrated as a hero. President Franklin D. Roosevelt awarded him the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military distinction, during a formal White House ceremony. Doolittle was later promoted to brigadier general and held several key command positions for the remainder of the war. In his later years, he insisted that the Tokyo Raid was not a great military victory, but rather a moral victory, exactly what America needed during the dark days after Pearl Harbor. The surviving pilots became living legends. They established a special tradition. Every April 18th, the remaining Doolittle Raiders would gather to honor the fallen. During the ceremony, they would drink from silver goblets engraved with the names of each pilot. When one passed away, their goblet was turned upside down as a tribute and farewell. This ritual continued for decades until only a few remained, who then held a final ceremony to close the era. It was not just a memorial, but a symbol of unbreakable camaraderie. The fate of the captured pilots was another tragic chapter. 3 were publicly executed in Shanghai, 1 died from disease and mistreatment in prison, and 4 survived 40 months of brutal captivity, finally liberated at the end of the war. Upon returning home, their bodies were frail and their spirits scarred, but their stories stood as testimony to extraordinary resilience. The U.S. government formally honored them, while their comrades revered them as unsung heroes who bore the harshest costs of the mission. One of the most profound human stories was that of Jacob DeShazer. A bombardier on one of the B-25s, he was captured and endured years of hardship. After the war, instead of harboring bitterness, DeShazer became a missionary, returning to Japan to spread a message of forgiveness and reconciliation. He even befriended Mitsuo Fuchida, the lead commander of the Pearl Harbor attack. 2 men who had once been enemies, dropping bombs on each other's heads, shook hands as friends. Their story is proof that even after the bloodiest conflicts, humanity can find forgiveness and reconciliation. For the Chinese people, memories of the raid remain intertwined with deep suffering. Hundreds of thousands of civilians were brutally killed by Japanese forces in reprisal campaigns. Entire villages were burned, families massacred, leaving wounds that never fully healed. While America celebrates the pilots, China remembers the event with both admiration and sorrow. It serves as a reminder that war is not only written in heroic pages, but also in the blood and tears of countless innocents. Today, in the collective memory of Americans, the Doolittle Raid is legendary. Aviation museums display B-25s, documentaries and films recreate the scene of planes taking off from the USS Hornet, bombs falling on Tokyo, and nighttime escapes. For the Japanese, the event was once a blow to national pride, but over decades it has been recognized as a historical lesson. No nation is completely safe, and strategic arrogance always carries a price. Militarily, the Doolittle Raid affirmed the power of creativity in warfare. It showed that a bold plan, even small in scale, could have effects far beyond expectations. It also highlighted the role of spirit, a non-material yet decisive factor in the endurance of a nation during critical moments. Without this moral boost, America might have taken much longer to restore confidence after Pearl Harbor. From a humanitarian perspective, the legacy of the raid extends beyond the battlefield. It depicts the duality of war, where courage and ingenuity exist alongside destruction and loss. It also opens the door to reconciliation, as former enemies can eventually find forgiveness and connection. This dimension makes the event not merely a past victory, but a timeless lesson for the present and future. In 2013, long after James Doolittle's death, the 4 remaining surviving pilots gathered for a ceremony at the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force. They raised silver goblets in memory of the 76 comrades who had passed. It was their final reunion, ending a tradition that had lasted more than 7 decades. Yet their legacy lives on. In the hearts of millions, the Doolittle Raiders continue to soar through the sky as immortal symbols of courage. The 1942 Tokyo Raid, in the strictest military sense, was not a major battle. It did not immediately determine the outcome of the theater, nor cause extensive material damage to the enemy. But it proved a vital truth. In war, morale and belief can be as powerful as bombs and bullets. With just 16 planes, Doolittle shook an empire, altered enemy strategic thinking, and inspired his allies' fighting spirit. This was a victory measured not in numbers, but in the hearts it changed. And that is why, more than 80 years later, when the world recalls the Doolittle Raid, it remembers not just a daring military operation, but an enduring spiritual legacy, courage, creativity, sacrifice, and the capacity to rise above hatred toward reconciliation. This is the greatest gift the pilots of that era left to history.